Jim Colosimo rose from the dark alleys of Chicago, where poverty and vice reigned supreme. A shrewd survivor, he navigated the treacherous world of street crime, quickly earning a reputation for his cunning and charisma. With an unyielding drive for power, Jim forged alliances with corrupt officials and street-level hustlers, transforming his small-time schemes into a web of influence that spread across the city. As he built his empire, the streets buzzed with the stories of his ambition and brutality. When the opportunity arose to capitalize on the city's thriving vice trade, Jim seized it, setting the stage for his rise to become a pivotal figure in organized crime. This was just the beginning of his reign, a journey that would forever change the face of Chicago. Even though Big Jim was considered as the first vice lord in Chicago, there was Michael Cassius McDonald. He is considered to have introduced organized crime to the city, and to have also established its first political machine. However, that's another story, and for this story, we'll be focusing on Big Jim Colosimo. The story begins in late 19th century Calabria, a region in southern Italy situated between the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas. This mountainous area features thin coastal lowlands and isolated inland villages connected by dirt roads. Historically, Calabria was the most economically depressed region of Italy, fostering strong family loyalty, but also attracting bandits who engaged in robbery and extortion. One small town in this region is Colosimo, which had only one winding road leading into it and two smaller roads within the town itself. Dirt paths connected these roads. Colosimo housed nearly 3,000 residents, many of whom shared the Colosimo surname. Vincenzo Colosimo was born on February 16, 1878, in Colosimo, Italy. His parents were Luigi Colosimo and Giuseppina Mascaro, Luigi's second wife. Vincenzo had an older half-brother named Antonio, born in 1871, and two younger sisters, Maria, born in 1880, and Elizabeth, also known as Bettina, born in 1882. When Vincenzo was 13, he traveled to America with his 21-year-old half-brother Antonio, due to economic challenges in Italy. They boarded the steamship SS Alsatia in May 1891, departing from Naples and stopping in Palermo and Gibraltar. After a challenging 3-week journey of 3,639 miles across the turbulent Atlantic Ocean, the ship arrived in New York Harbor on June 3, 1891. Following their arrival, Antonio and Vincenzo traveled by train to Chicago. In Chicago, Vincenzo settled in a crowded apartment in the Italian neighborhood at the southern edge of downtown. His father, Luigi, likely arranged for this through correspondence with other recent immigrants from Colosimo. After ensuring Vincenzo's arrival and fulfilling his duty of bringing him to Chicago, Antonio returned to their hometown of Colosimo, Italy, where he married Giacinto Parma and spent the rest of his life. In Chicago, Vincenzo changed his name to Jim Colosimo and began his journey that would lead him to become known as Big Jim Colosimo. At the turn of the century, Chicago's population surpassed 1.5 million, with a police force of 2,430 officers, struggling to manage a rising wave of crime, including over 100 homicides each year. They had limited resources to combat the growing prostitution industry, where streetwalkers frequented Lake and Randolph streets and illicit activities thrived in inns and taverns. As the city evolved, the visible and vulgar nature of prostitution became socially unacceptable. Despite city council ordinances banning it since the 1830s, authorities chose regulation over elimination, allowing certain areas to operate as vice districts without police interference. Although illegal, these districts functioned with impunity, eventually paving the way for the notorious Levee, the cradle of organized crime in Chicago. This segregation fostered rampant corruption within local government, with police, aldermen, and judges all vying for a share of the lucrative vice operations. These districts attracted low-quality economic activity, leading to shoddy businesses and illicit practices. Some brothels drugged wealthy clients to steal from them, leaving victims without legal recourse. Confidence men operated freely, preying on unsuspecting patrons, resulting in frequent drunkenness, fights, and violence. Chicago earned its reputation as a wide-open town in the 1850s, with travelers sharing stories of rampant vice. During the Civil War, many prostitutes flocked to the city, drawn by patrons visiting Randolph Street's Gamblers' Row, where up to 1,300 women could be found in saloons and bordellos. In its early years, Chicago had several areas where prostitution thrived, including the Sands, located near the mouth of the Chicago River. First reported in the mid-1850s, it housed the city's lowest-class prostitutes in crude wooden shanties. In 1857, Mayor Long John Wentworth ordered the shacks destroyed, prompting the prostitutes to relocate. Red light districts emerged in the downtown area along Lake and Randolph Streets, as well as Adams and Wells Streets. Brothels also appeared along State and Dearborn Streets, with additional vice activities in Little Cheyenne and the near West Side. These areas attracted affluent men, especially with the Dearborn Street Railroad station nearby. The first step for a young Italian immigrant to gain acceptance in the big city was adopting an American name. Dropping Vincenzo, he began to use James or Jim and accepted the Americanized pronunciation of his last name. Jim lived at 204 Polk Street, a few blocks south of the downtown business center, in a small colony of immigrant Southern Italians. Despite the oppressive poverty and overcrowding, this was one of the most openly vicious neighborhoods in Chicago. Social conditions were dire, with dilapidated buildings, uncollected garbage, and broken sewer pipes contributing to the squalor. In the rear of many structures were foul-smelling stables for workhorses with manure piles in the unpaved alleys. In this environment, Jim engaged in early criminal activities such as pickpocketing and minor extortions as part of a 6-member gang. His first legitimate job involved joining other illiterate, penniless Italian boys, who rose at 2:30 a.m. to sell the morning papers, where he learned the language and street laws. He filled the time between editions by shining shoes and selling gum, as well as running errands for local gamblers. He briefly tried hard labor by digging ditches before obtaining a position as a water boy for a railroad maintenance crew. At the age of 15, Jim secured a job as a gandy dancer, responsible for adjusting rails and hammering spikes into ties on the railroad. Gandy dancers were known for their toughness and heavy drinking. Young Jim earned a reputation as the toughest member of his crew. With his railroad pay, he often visited local saloons in the red light district. While he was friendly and jovial when out, his temperament could quickly change to unforgiving when angered. Jim later moved into the apartment of Emilio and Emanuela Di Stefano at 416 South Clark Street. Emilio, an honest man born in Lorenzana, Italy in 1845, ran a grocery and a private banking operation. Emanuela had several children, including Rocco, born in 1875. Jim lived with the Di Stefanos on and off for nearly 10 years, forming a lasting friendship with their son. Although Rocco pursued a legal career, Jim ventured into vice and the restaurant business, while also getting involved in local politics. From his foster parents, Jim learned valuable lessons. In their peaceful home, he developed a love for classical music and opera. Emilio instilled in him a sense of commercial integrity, which characterized Jim's business dealings throughout his life. He was known for always keeping his word and fulfilling his business obligations, with no records of him ever cheating or failing to repay debts. On April 4, 1896, Jim completed his citizenship paperwork at the Circuit Court of Cook County, filing under a provision that allowed minors to become citizens. Rocco witnessed the application, affirming that Jim had demonstrated good moral character. That same day, the Circuit Court judge officially granted Jim Colosimo his American citizenship. Living in Chicago, Jim observed a vibrant and chaotic environment. The red light district near his home was filled with prostitutes soliciting on the sidewalks and standing in doorways. One incident involved police raiding several brothels and arresting a dozen scantily clad women. The police captain aimed to win convictions by parading the women in court in their underwear, but Municipal Court Judge Goggin opposed this tactic. He criticized the officers for their approach, stating it was inappropriate to display the women publicly, and he ultimately released them, reprimanding the police for their actions. In the 1890s, Jim witnessed a remarkable Chicago, with saloons operating around the clock and red light districts thriving alongside respectable businesses. He learned that State's Attorney Charles S. Deneen, in office from 1896 to 1904, considered his role as a prosecutor rather than a vice enforcer. As a result, vice activities flourished unchecked. From a street-level perspective, Jim gained insights into the prostitution business. For a time he acted as a small-time pimp, managing several women, but after a run-in with the police regarding his street workers, he opted to pursue other opportunities. On September 10, 1897, Mayor Carter Harrison Jr. announced a new initiative aimed at cleaning the downtown streets and alleys of Chicago, primarily to remove horse manure. This effort led to the formation of the street sweepers, nicknamed the White Wings due to their white uniforms. Equipped with wide-mouthed shovels, large brooms, and circular carts with steel-rimmed wheels, the sweepers began their work in the First Ward, employing mostly recent Italian immigrants who secured their jobs through local padrones. Through the padrone system, Jim secured a position as a street sweeper, earning $1.50 a day. Proud of his title as a White Wing, Jim pushed his cart behind drays, wagons, and streetcars, quickly gaining respect from his peers. He organized his fellow Italian workers into a social and athletic club, influencing their voting on election days. Jim's leadership among the White Wings caught the attention of First Ward Alderman John Coughlin, also known as Bathhouse John, who appointed him as assistant precinct captain. This position allowed Jim to leverage his newfound political influence into a promotion to foreman of the street sweepers, increasing his pay to $2 a day. Serving as assistant precinct captain provided Jim with a certain level of advantage, meaning he was now virtually immune to arrest. Precinct captains and their assistants formed the backbone of political organizations in Chicago, personally registering voters in their wards and ensuring they supported party candidates on election day. They were involved in various electoral frauds, from filling out blank ballots to intimidating opposition voters, bribing election officials, and even resorting to violence. Leveraging his political role, Jim organized a substantial voter base in the Italian community around Polk and Clark Streets. Jim understood that local political power hinged on friendship and favors. He naturally built relationships across all ranks, earning the trust of Italian immigrants. Through Alderman Coughlin, he offered his followers city services and public jobs, helping them with school admissions, licensing exams, jail bailouts, and healthcare access. Growing up in a feudal system in Italy, Jim adapted well to the similar dynamics in the First Ward. He also used his connections to supplement his income beyond his salary as a street sweeper. By 1902, Jim had broadened his business pursuits by opening a pool room. He then shifted his focus to a new avenue for income and influence, the White Wing Social and Athletic Club. Collaborating with Anthony D'Andrea from the 19th Ward, Dago Mike Carrozzo, and Republican Ward Committeeman Diamond Joe Esposito, Jim transformed the club into Chicago's first union of street sweepers. This organization, known as the Chicago Laborers, would mark Jim's initial efforts to organize and gain control over various labor unions primarily made up of Italian immigrants. To lead the union, Jim appointed Mike Carrozzo. Jim's rise in the First Ward Democratic Party and his progress within the White Wings were largely thanks to two powerful figures, Alderman John Coughlin and Michael Kenna. Among Chicago's most notorious political leaders, Coughlin and Kenna held sway over the First Ward for years, controlling elections to the extent that no mayor or political boss dared to challenge them. Their story of gaining dominance in the city council is remarkable. In the late 1890s, Jim met Victoria Moresco, an Italian immigrant running a brothel at the western edge of the Levee. On July 22, 1902, Jim married Victoria. In the early 1900s, Big Jim Colosimo and Victoria Moresco, operated a joint prostitution business. Their brothels were neither the most luxurious nor the lowest-tier establishments, but were well regarded for consistently attracting customers with a steady influx of new workers. These brothels gained a good reputation by avoiding unethical practices like drugging customers' drinks or using panel rooms. Colosimo expanded carefully, adding one operation at a time. After opening the Victoria, they established the Saratoga at 22nd and Dearborn Streets. Over time, Colosimo acquired several crib shacks in Bedbug Row. He retained 60% of the earnings from each worker, which was typical for the era, and the women were responsible for purchasing their own clothing and services. With his connections offering protection, Colosimo and Moresco quickly grew their enterprise to include 4 brothels, 2 $1 houses, and 2 $2 houses. To manage fluctuating customer demand, workers were discreetly moved between locations via a dirt alley behind the buildings, ensuring smooth operations without the patrons noticing. Big Jim began bringing his family from Italy to Chicago as his business thrived. His brother Frank was the first to arrive in 1902, but he struggled with Chicago's fast-paced life. After multiple trips back and forth, Frank decided to settle in Italy, marrying there, though he briefly visited Chicago in 1920 for Jim's estate proceedings. Jim's father, Luigi, arrived in 1903 from Naples, joining Jim in Chicago. Luigi never learned English or became a citizen, but he worked closely with Jim, helping with business dealings. Jim's sister Bettina arrived in 1899, and although she stayed briefly, she returned to Italy along with Frank. Only Luigi remained in Chicago with Jim. In the early 1900s, Big Jim expanded into legitimate business, opening the Coliseum Billiard and Pool Room in 1902, a notable venture due to its own phone line. In 1905, he advertised the pool room in World's Annual Sporting Records, featuring a photo of himself. He hired Victoria Moresco's brothers, Joseph and John, to help, eventually passing the pool room to them. In 1904, Jim opened the Colosimo Hotel and Saloon, which became well known for its elegance and fine wines, later leading to the famed Colosimo's Café. In 1909, with a steady income from his brothel operations, Jim bought a home at 3156 South Vernon Avenue. Afterward, he transferred the property between family members, and in February 1920, following his divorce from Victoria, Jim transferred ownership of the property from Victoria back to his father Luigi. Jim believed his vice syndicate was secure, with no issues from other operators. He had strong ties with Coughlin and Kenna and handled their protection money collections, with the police under control through payoffs. However, Clifford Rowe, a farm boy from Indiana, soon posed a major threat, leading to investigations, raids, arrests, and potential felony charges for Jim and his men. And as for Rowe, he could not be bribed. Rowe quickly emerged as a key figure in Chicago's battle against white slavery and prostitution. His commitment to ending white slavery in the Levee gained widespread attention, making him known to every brothel operator, madam, and officer at the 22nd Street Police Station. Johnny Torrio, a key figure in early 20th century organized crime, immigrated to the U.S. as a child. He rose to power in New York's criminal world, earning respect for his calm demeanor and skill in handling both law enforcement and rival gangs. Torrio's visits to other cities for boxing events led him to Chicago in the early 1900s, where he met Big Jim Colosimo. Impressed by the opportunity, Torrio was persuaded by Colosimo to leave Brooklyn and join his vice operation, eventually relocating to Chicago. Clifford Rowe, the assistant state's attorney in Chicago, told reporters that they had gathered solid evidence of women being trafficked for Colosimo's operations, with routes extending from St. Louis to New York and Chicago. They had testimonies from women held in the Saratoga and Victoria resorts, including one who had been brutally beaten. Rowe named several key figures in the Colosimo operation, including Sam Hare, the manager of the Victoria, John Torrio, the manager of the Saratoga, and Joe Bovo, one of the agents in charge of recruiting women for the resorts. He also mentioned that other members of Colosimo's network were still being investigated. This case provided confirmation that Torrio had been involved with Colosimo's operations as early as 1909. Ultimately, Hare and Torrio were dismissed for insufficient evidence, and on December 24, 1909, Bovo pled guilty and was convicted of pandering. The Black Hand emerged around the turn of the century, when Italian criminals in New York and Chicago began extorting their fellow Italian immigrants. They sent threatening letters featuring a black hand or the phrase mano nera, preying on the immigrants' fear of authority and language barriers. If victims refused to pay, the threats escalated to violence, including beatings, bombings, and murders. While some mistakenly believed the Black Hand was a single organized crime group, it was actually a method of extortion used by various criminals. In one instance, on November 22, 1911, a shooting in Chicago left 2 men dead and another severely wounded. The likely motive was that the victims had been involved in blackmailing Colosimo with Black Hand threats, leading to Torrio being sent to resolve the issue. In 1911, Torrio faced a serious issue when agents from the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, later known as the FBI, visited a brothel in Bridgeport, Connecticut. They followed a tip that some women had been transported across state lines for prostitution. One of the women testified that Torrio and Maurice Van Bever had transported her from Chicago to Bridgeport on behalf of Colosimo. The woman agreed to testify, and federal agents placed her temporarily in jail for protection. However, Torrio learned of the investigation through informants and sought help from his New York associate, Frankie Yale. Yale used his connections to find the woman's location. One afternoon, 2 men posing as federal agents arrived at the jail, claiming the woman needed to be relocated for her safety. The jailers were deceived and handed over the woman, whose body, shot 12 times, was found in a graveyard the next day. The jailers later identified the men as members of Torrio's New York gang. With the woman's death, the planned indictments were dropped, and although Torrio and Colosimo were questioned, they denied any involvement in the kidnapping or murder and were released without charges. By the end of 1914, Torrio had risen to become Big Jim's second-in-command, overseeing Colosimo's resorts in the Levee. He was also in charge of managing gambling operations, roadhouses, and resorts in the southern and western suburbs. On July 20, 1914, Jim Colosimo was formally arrested for the first time, tied to the Levee shooting of Sergeant Stanley Burns. The state's attorney began presenting witnesses to the grand jury, aiming to indict both Colosimo and Torrio. Shortly after, on July 30th, Mayor Carter Harrison Jr. revoked a liquor license for the New Brighton Cafe, operated by Torrio. By late August, Harrison extended this action to revoke the licenses of Colosimo's establishment, Freiberg's, and several other saloons. While these moves challenged Kenna's political dominance in the Levee, the momentum faltered. On September 16th, Assistant City Prosecutor Marshall Solberg quietly withdrew 2 cases against Colosimo for after-hours liquor sales, citing insufficient evidence but leaving the option to reinstate them, an action that never occurred. Ultimately, charges against Colosimo, Torrio, and others were dismissed in criminal court. On October 15, 1917, Colosimo and Torrio acquired the Speedway Inn in Burnham, placing Jew Kid Grabiner in charge. This became the 3rd major roadhouse Torrio operated for Colosimo in the area. Nearby, they also ran gambling joints with slot machines and inexpensive brothels where women earned 80 cents per client. Members of the Colosimo gang managed these establishments. In 1917, Big Jim began falling for a young singer named Dale Winter. As his feelings for Dale grew, Victoria, his wife, noticed the developing romantic connection and became increasingly upset. Her discontent deepened when she discovered that Jim had given Dale an expensive fur coat just a day after gifting her a similar one. Victoria left their home on Vernon Avenue and moved in with a relative in a western suburb. At midnight on January 17, 1920, the National Prohibition Act took effect. In response, saloons and night spots in the Loop shut down temporarily as owners debated whether to reopen as restaurants serving near beer or to close permanently. Despite efforts by city officials and the state's attorney to enforce the law, Prohibition violations became widespread, with liquor and beer readily available in countless saloons and illicit speakeasies. Although not yet widely recognized as a vice boss, Torrio leveraged Colosimo's strong reputation. Big Jim was seen by Levee operators and others in the vice industry as a powerful figure with political ties at the ward, city, and state levels. Torrio was readily accepted as Colosimo's trusted associate. While Colosimo focused on other matters, Torrio acted decisively to advance his own position. In late 1919 to early 1920, Johnny Torrio convinced Al Capone that the financial gains from working in Chicago's criminal underworld far outweighed anything he could ever earn, and Capone agreed. In April 1920, Big Jim married Dale Winter, 2 weeks after divorcing Victoria. 3 weeks later, on May 11, 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was shot dead. Big Jim Colosimo's murder marked a pivotal shift in Chicago's criminal underworld. As Prohibition loomed large over the nation, the opportunities it presented were immense, but they also exposed deep divisions within Colosimo's empire. While Colosimo was content with the steady wealth from his brothels and gambling houses, Johnny Torrio saw the untapped potential of the illegal alcohol trade. Prohibition was not just a law, it was a business opportunity of unparalleled scale, and Torrio was determined not to let it pass. Reportedly, Colosimo, however, wanted nothing to do with the bootlegging business. He dismissed Torrio's proposals, believing the risks far outweighed the rewards. Torrio, ever pragmatic, saw this refusal as a roadblock to his vision of expanding their empire. He understood that the organization needed to adapt or risk being overtaken by rivals. On the day of the murder, Colosimo was at his cafe. It was a familiar scene of routine, but one that would end in betrayal. The night before his assassination, according to this book, Torrio called Colosimo at home and informed him that he had arranged for 2 truckloads of high-quality whiskey to be delivered to the cafe. Torrio insisted that Jim needed to be at the restaurant to personally receive the shipment. Although Jim hadn't planned on going and initially resisted, Torrio convinced him that he had to be there to receive the delivery. Eventually, Colosimo reluctantly agreed to meet the trucks. A few minutes after entering the restaurant, he was shot and killed by a gunman hiding in the cloakroom. Suspicion quickly fell on Torrio, whose ambitions aligned perfectly with the timing of the murder. Many believe Torrio enlisted the help of his New York ally, Francesco Yoeli, or better known as Frankie Yale, to carry out the hit. Yale was known for his efficiency and discretion, making him an ideal choice for such a critical task. With Colosimo out of the way, Torrio was free to take the reins and steer the organization into the lucrative bootlegging trade, cementing his position as a key architect of the Chicago outfit's rise to power. Big Jim's death was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by the ruthless pursuit of power and wealth in the age of Prohibition.